Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name is Keith. I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose, where we host in person events along with partnered and supported events, trips, and classes. We recently just relocated both our branch stores at Union Market and the Wharf and have started hosting events there. We have events calendars at the front of the store if you want to check out our full listing of events for this month, and then check our website for June and July events as well. Before we get started today, if you could just take a moment to silence your cell phone so we don't disrupt the event. When we get time to opening the floor for your questions, we have a mic stand here at this pillar. We're live streaming tonight's program so that you or anyone you know can now find it at the Politics and Prose YouTube channel. Following the Q&A, we're going to have a signing line right up here at this table, lining up again by the pillar. If you haven't already purchased the book, we have lots of copies at the checkout registers up front. We're going to ask you to line up, and we'll come by and ask your name for personalizations. So please have your books ready for us when you get into the line. And once the event is complete, we ask that you fold up your chairs and just lean them against something sturdy to help us out a bit. So now, without further ado, I'm very excited to welcome Claire Messud, celebrating the release of her new book, This Strange Eventful History. She's the author of 6 works of fiction, a recipient of the Guggenheim and Radcliffe Fellowships and the Strauss Living Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She teaches at Harvard University and lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her novel, it's about a family that rides the waves of current events and personal conflicts across 3 generations. And as one review says, Messud paints compelling portraits of internal conflicts and tangled relationships, dropping along the way tantalizing references to crucial events that will be clarified later in a rich narrative that defies summary. Messud will be in conversation with Bethanne Patrick, a writer and author whose reviews and author profiles appear in many publications. She's the Penn Faulkner Literary Foundation Programs Chair and teaches creative writing at American University. Please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Claire Messud and Bethanne Patrick.
Hi, everybody.
I'm so excited to have a footrest. New thing for me here at Politics and Prose. So I'm Bethanne Patrick. This is Claire Messud. I'm so delighted to introduce her to you all.
Thank you, Bethanne. Thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to be here.
It is, and what a great crowd. We have a lovely evening, and I know there is so much to talk about with this strange, eventful history. You already heard a little bit about how it has to do with Claire's family, but it's also fiction. So we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Claire, tell us all when you knew you were really into this book. You were really writing it.
Bethanne, who knows? I mean, I feel as though it's one of those things where I can go back and say, oh, I think probably for 20 years I had some idea that I would write a book like this. Or I can say, I know that 10 years ago I was doing research about the history of Algeria. I mean, it's also worth saying I published a novel in, I don't exactly know when, but it may have been the last century. Or the very beginning of this one, called The Last Life, which is about a pieds-noirs family in France. The pieds-noirs were the French Algerians in colonials who then repatriated to France. So I published a novel that was on this sort of, but was not at all autobiographical. I thought I was so canny. There was some incidents in a family that my aunt worked for, and I took some of those incidents and I made up a family. I didn't know those people. I made up a family and I made them pieds-noirs, and then I showed the novel to my aunt and she said, but they are pieds-noirs. So, oops. But that was 20 years ago. So then I feel that there are sort of different moments. When did I think I would write a novel? I think I always knew I might write more about this world, and then it became more and more focused, and then at some point, I thought, well, I'll actually try to write some version, however loosely tied, but to the family experience, because it seemed almost Zelig like, right? Like my very ordinary family, having left Algeria, kind of appeared in various. They sort of dotted around
almost
in various
stumbled
places. Yeah.
Into these situations, almost stumbled into knowing famous people or being in a conflict or involved in a great endeavor. It's really interesting. It is an eventful history. So it's not a memoir, it's a novel. So talk about that, because most of us probably think, well, when you're writing about your family, it is a memoir or some kind of remembrance. How have you coped with fictionalizing real people? And I know there was sort of a Rubicon for you, if you will.
Was there? Did I tell you there was a Rubicon?
Well, the deaths, Claire.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah,
so sorry.
So yeah, everybody's dead. I mean, not everybody. My sister is not dead, inshallah. But the older generations are gone, and I think that was very liberating for me in some way. I as a teacher, I teach creative writing, and your students are always asking, how can I write about my family in the ways that I want to without upsetting people? That's a really good question.
Yeah, not while they're alive.
Right. So I didn't. I didn't. Although it's an interesting thing, because you write fictional characters, and then people say, "Why did you write about this person?" And then you say, "Well, it wasn't about this person." Then you think, "Well, maybe it wasn't. I didn't know." But so yes, their deaths was a big part of it. But the other thing I would say, because I feel as though this question of fiction versus memoir, I write fiction. I just make stuff up. Like when I was young, I worked at the Guardian newspaper, and it just seemed, I never did, but it seemed so tempting. Just to I worked in features. I wasn't in news, right? But I mean, we know people are doing it in news the entire time. But it just seems so tempting. Like I could just, just a detail or two, make it a little more vivid. Of course, there are. My husband worked at the New Republic in a moment when there were some people making a lot of stuff up. Yeah. So I think of it though. I think of it as like papier mâché. Right. So there's a person or there's a series of events, and it's sort of a form. Mm-hmm. And then you kind of wrap a lot of gunk around it, a lot of gunk, and then it's something else. And would you say it's the coat hanger? No, you'd say now it's an elephant. Right. And that's what fiction is. And if it, so it's worth saying. So my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, in his retirement, wrote for my sister and me quite a long handwritten memoir of his life, his and our grandmother's lives, from the time when they married in 1928 to 1946. And the opening section of the novel, which takes place in 1940, it draws on some elements in that, a scene, a couple of scenes in that memoir, but the scenes were, there's a scene at the time of the fall of France when the character who's based on my grandfather attends a party at the Romanian consulate, which had been, the invitation had been issued long before. The Romanians, of course, were, I don't think at that point sort of officially, but they were Axis, they were sympathizing with the Nazis. So the question was, do you go or not go at the time of the fall of France? And he decided that he should go. He was not the senior person. He felt somebody should go. Anyway, that's like 5 lines or 7 lines. And then, what was he thinking? What was he wearing? What were they doing? What did they say? All that, you make it up.
That's the stuff of fiction.
That's
absolutely.
The stuff of fiction. What was the weather like?
You can't know it from those 5 lines. And so you do have different perspectives in this strange, eventful history. And I think that it's interesting to know who read it first, because you had to have someone in the family. Did your sister read it, for example?
She did read it. She wasn't the first person to read it. She didn't read it until it was finished. And she was very supportive of it. She was supportive of it, and we did not have a long conversation about it.
Okay. Now, who did read it then?
So, James, who I'm married to, he's a literary critic, and people
just
always,
in case you don't know,
people always
James
say,
Wood.
People always say, that must be so hard having a literary critic for a husband, and I always say, it's not hard for me. It's hard for him, because I want him to be, completely honest and his critical self, and completely supportive and loving at the same time. That's easy for me.
No problem whatsoever. I'm sure it is a very peaceful household. But there is something, and of course, James knew about this already, since he is a character. He's Oliver in the book. Just a hint there for all of you.
We have a dog named Oliver.
See,
this
is
dog.
where you get material, aspiring writers. So there is a family. I don't know if you would call it a skeleton in the closet, but there is, something that's gone on in the family, and you need to read this novel, so we're not going to tell you anything more about it. But the point is, this is a book, partly because of that is really about your paternal family, not about your maternal lineage. And so let's talk about not just how these people interacted with the wider world, but also what they mean to you, and what your grandfather, your father, and their world, and what they knew has affected you personally and as a writer.
Thank you, Bethanne. That's a big question. I feel like there's a lot to say about it, and I think, I might start by saying that when my grandfather, when he wrote this memoir, he called it Everything That We Believed In. And one of the reasons, or one of the things that I was thinking as I was working on the book, is that if it, in some way, for my children, this novel is also, everything that we believed in, right? Mm-hmm. That the world that I grew up into, and that my parents led me to hope for and anticipate, which was a sort of optimistic post-war time into the 90s. Do you remember 1989, when we all thought there would be no more wars and everything was going to be hunky-dory? And but it was a belief in a sort of internationalism, and in boundaries coming down, and in tribalisms ending, and in hybridization and cooperation, and So that I feel like, in the same way that when my grandfather is writing about a world in which, as he said in a letter that he wrote to be opened in the war, to be opened in the event of his death, his and my grandmother's deaths, he wrote for my father and my aunt, in which he said, "This is what it's important for you to know. We are Mediterranean, we are Latin, we are Catholic, we are French," in that order. Right, and of course, I'm a non-practicing American Protestant. Two generations later. So
you failed him.
but I feel like it is. I mean, that seems to me so much maybe it's just the trajectory of history generally, but certainly of the second half of the 20th century. A time of migrations and upheavals. And, I remember when we lived in Australia, my mother had a good friend who was Jewish from Germany, who had escaped via China, and had lived in China before going to Australia, right? Like, I feel as though we're in a time of migrations, and it's possible sometimes to think that this is new, but it's just new. I mean, it's just maybe new communities and populations who are on the move, and the fact is that's the way of the world, and the change is always underway.
I think this is so important that you're talking about this, because I do see this as a novel that is almost about, it's almost a first generation novel in a way, because your father is the one who chose to come to North America for education. And originally he came to the United States, had lots of adventures, had a lot of fun. And then, of course, he wound up in Canada. Did he meet your mother in Canada? I'm not recalling.
They met at a summer course in England.
In England, there you go. So you see, and so it's quite interesting in focusing again on your paternal lineage, to think about your father as an immigrant, and to remember also that the pieds-noirs faced a great deal of discrimination from France, even though they were French citizens and had come from a French background. But of course, there had been plenty of intermarrying and changes. And when they were supposed to come back for service as bureaucrats, et cetera, in the military, they were often not treated very well. And I'm wondering how much of that your father saw sent him across the ocean.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. So absolutely, and I think there's several things. One, I would say, for me, part of the wanting to have this historical sweep. The novel starts in 1940 and ends in 2010, so it covers a lot of. You don't have. It's not like and then. I promise.
No, it really isn't.
There's sort of a section in each decade, just almost like a probe going down into a moment in each decade. But one of the things that I wanted to be thinking about is how we see the same things differently with the passage of time. How much our the moment of history into which we are born affects how we understand the world. And so for the generation born at the beginning of the 20th century, for my grandparents' generation, for most people, certainly for my grandparents, who were very devoutly Catholic, they were great French patriots. They believed that colonialism, they had an unconflicted relationship to colonialism. They believed that it was about bringing wonderful French culture and the Christian religion to people who hadn't had the good fortune to have it before. And of course, by the time of my parents' generation, or my father and my aunt, it was no longer possible in the post-war moment to have that unconflicted relation to colonialism, and people saw it in much more complex and strife-ridden terms. And now, of course, it's further again. I mean, we've moved further again, and I think my children, for example, could, in the same way that my daughter can barely conceive of the idea that my mother, when my mother married in the late 50s, it was assumed she would stay home and have kids. And my daughter can't really believe that's true. I think it's really hard for us to actually make a leap and not just see all of those people 120 or 140 years ago as evil and wrong. But they were just people. That's part of what I wanted to write. They were people just like us. We are doing things. We have done things. We do things daily that 30 years from now, our children and grandchildren will look at with horror and dismay.
And vice versa. I just want to tell you all that Harrison Butker's mother was my classmate at Smith College. She's a physicist. So sometimes our children do things that cause us dismay.
I just to finish the thing. So I think my father, one of the things I was writing about, the character that is based on my father and the character that's based on my aunt, in this sort of conflicted generation, react very differently to the Algerian conflict and to Algerian independence.
Yes.
And my father, he never spoke to us about any of it. And I think that he wanted us to be American kids, and he wanted us to be free of that history and that legacy, and to be able to move forward into the future, in an unencumbered way.
One of the ways that I was able to see the book in a way that readers won't be able to is I got to see all of the images from your extensive family archives, which are fascinating. And I'm going in two places with that. One is in seeing the passports and various bills of passage and visas. You can see this travel in documentation, and it's really, really beautiful. But what I wanted to ask you about those archives is, what surprised you in them? And I don't mean necessarily anything shocking. I'm just talking about, was there something where you didn't see photos of someone you thought there would be photos of, that kind of thing?
I think, funnily enough, what I would say surprised me the most is the fact that my grandfather in the 70s, when my sister and I were little kids, wrote to us, to our future selves. So it's written to us as grown-ups, and he says, you probably won't read this for 30 years, and he was right. But it's full of all sorts of details that you wouldn't tell your grandchildren.
And not necessarily anything untoward, but things that are just very adult.
Yes, things that are very adult and
portentous.
But also some, so did you know, maybe you did, that in Beirut in the 1930s, he was the naval attaché at the French consulate in Beirut in from 36 to 39, and they were very uxorious and devoutly Catholic, but it was a big wife swapping scene, and he describes, going to being invited to the dinner parties, and how the rooms were sort of laid out. It sounds a little like a sort of nightclub in Lower Manhattan, but
it sounds like the ice storm
right?
all over
yes.
again.
I mean, it's sort of amazing, because it is these details that you wouldn't have expected to find, and we, lots of iterations, not necessarily salacious in that way, but lots of things that you're like, oh, who knew? Oh, wow.
Right. So interesting. You also have an incredibly, may I say, good-looking family. I mean, these are, grandfather, hubba. And so it's really interesting to think about, because Gaston and Lucienne, the grandfather and grandmother in the story, are very much in love, and everyone is very handsome. But this is where I get to Tante Denise, who is of a completely different sort of complexion. She's blue-eyed and blonde. She's not dark. Her hair is a little sparse. She's got wonky eyes, so she's wearing glasses from a very young age. She winds up never marrying, never having children, incredibly well-educated, a lawyer, at a time when women didn't attend law school, especially women who were French or pieds-noirs for that matter. And she has an extraordinary section, more than one section in the book, but the one when she's younger is the one that I'm thinking about. And I wanted to ask about your inhabiting that voice, because it seems to me that the roles of women in the family, and again, paternal, not maternal line, but there are women, of course, and there are women who are very, very humble and simple country women. And then there are women like Denise who grow up and become very sophisticated. And so tell me a little bit about that part.
Yeah, it is a thing that was always, that I think I had to be probably middle-aged to kind of see in any way clearly. There was this almost cartoonish disjunction in our family that my mother, Canadian, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, very much, a sort of budding feminist in my youth, somebody who I always think, she was watching the feminist movement in the early 70s, like somebody, with her two little kids at her feet, like almost as if the boat was, she was like, wait for me. She was just that little bit too old to kind of fully fly. Set sail. And then on the other side, my French relatives, where tradition and patriarchy and Catholicism so that my grandfather in the memoir records that when he was full of ambition for everybody. And when his children were born, he thought, my son will grow up and do great things, and my daughter could grow up and marry somebody important. And my aunt didn't want to do that. And so one of the things that makes her a very poignant figure to me is that she was super Catholic, super religious her whole life, and because of that, did believe that she, in a very old school, not a contemporary Catholic way, but a sort of old school Catholic way, she really did believe and had internalized that a woman's role on earth was to marry and have children, which she did not want to do. So there had to be a lot of fancy footwork, and there was a lot of self-loathing, and yet on the other hand, she did live on her own terms. But I think there were a lot of freedoms that she didn't take, that she might have taken in another world.
There are so many voices. Again, as Claire's already said, this is not a book where it's and then, and then, and then. You are inhabiting different people in different ways. There is a first person voice. There are more than one. There's more than one first person voice. There are third person voices. There are letters. There are all kinds of ways. As you learned about your family through documents, you are revealing them in this fictional way through these voices. And, I was wondering while I was thinking up these questions, why don't we have a different word for masterful? For someone who is a woman who is writing, why is it masterful? And I don't want to say mistressful doesn't work. So this is something, that's right, madameful.
That's nice.
That's right, it is really a joy to read this strange, eventful history. And I know you are all going to love it. And before I turn things over to you to ask questions, because there's so many I know you're going to want to look at, I have a little bit of a lightning round for Claire. So these could be, I don't know, these could be really hardball. So first, which Bronte, Emily or Charlotte?
Charlotte.
Okay. Publishers Weekly or Kirkus?
Ooh, that's tough for me. Can I choose both?
All right. How about reading indoors versus outdoors?
Lying down. So
perfect, because that was my next question: chair or bed? So,
so like bed or chaise-longue or grassy knoll.
Okay, there we go. Grassy knoll. I like that. Keyboard or longhand?
Longhand.
And is that pen or pencil?
Pen.
Is that fountain pen or rollerball?
Microfine. Rollerball.
Oh, is that Uniball microfine?
Yes.
Excellent choice. Yeah, she wins. Ding, ding, ding. Coffee or tea?
Depends on the time of day.
Okay, so coffee in the morning, milky or black?
Milky.
Excellent. And how about your tea? Lemon or milk?
Milk.
Very well said also. Here's a very tough one, if you ask me. Mr. Darcy or Colonel Brandon?
Mr. Darcy.
Okay. How about, here's another, I think this is very tough. Toni Morrison, Beloved or Jazz?
Beloved.
Okay, she is very decisive. I love that. Okay, and finally, here's one. Well, you have a bias, but I thought I might as well ask. New York Times Book Review or The New Yorker?
I'm going to say the Washington Post.
Oh!
I'm going to say the Washington Post. I feel like I just want to say Ron Charles gave me the review I have dreamed of my whole life.
Oh.
So I want to say,
I love that. I want to say, I don't even know if you know this, but I reviewed The Burning Girl, and I met James Wood at the Nantucket Book Festival the summer after that came out in the Post, and said, I just want you to know how much I loved your wife's novel. And he said, that is the only review I read out loud to her. I thought, you know.
Thank
So you are welcome. But in the meantime, we've got two microphones, or do we have one? Just one.
Just
Here's the microphone. So if you would start lining up for questions, otherwise I can just keep, nattering on. But I know you have things you want to talk with Claire about. Has anyone in the audience been fortunate enough to read this book yet? No. Oh, what a treat you all have. What a treat. You're going to dive in and just completely find it fascinating. So, do you think, until someone does decide to ask a question, Claire, how long do you think it's going to take you to sort of get over this one? I know you're probably already working on something new, but you kind of, when did it land for you? It might have been some months ago, it might still be coming.
you mean the next thing?
No, this book, when did you feel like, oh, okay, I'm done with it, I'm finished,
I don't know. I think one of the things that is that is strange about a novel I read all there were, in addition to the thing my grandfather wrote, there were also these letters, family letters, so that from the 40s and 50s and 60s that I read in preparing for this novel, and it may sound sentimental, but just my little like riff about the letter. What we have lost in losing letters is so profound. And I read these letters, and these people were alive for me, and they were alive as before I knew them, but recognizably themselves. And in the intimacy of a letter, when you take the time to share, not online, not in pictures, not with not for public consumption, but I have something I want to share with you, and I think you're important enough, and I think I'm important enough to take the time to do it, and then it's there forever. And so one of the stacks of letters that I have is all the letters that the family wrote to my dad when he was studying in the U.S. in 1952-53. I don't have the letters he wrote home, but I have all the letters they wrote to him. And I was aware, as I took them out of their airmail envelopes, and they'd been sort of torn, and I could picture him coming out of the Amherst College post office, tearing open the letter, reading it as he went back to his dorm room, then stuffing it back inside, and thinking, since February 1953, nobody has taken this letter out of its envelope. But when I take it out, it's as alive and present as it was to him on that day. And I just the texts do not cut it. They do not cut it. So,
well, there we go. Claire Messud, not on social media. We do have a question. Thank you.
The Algerian Revolution was quite violent. Did your grandfather talk at all about that?
So they left in 1954, and somewhat paradoxically. So my father went to study in the U.S. in 52-53, and then after that was back in Algeria for 2 years, maybe finishing his degree. But my grandparents moved. He had a job in the almost at that point independent Morocco, and was there for a couple of years, and then took a job in Buenos Aires. So he did not write. His memoir stops in 1948. So it doesn't cover
that doesn't cover
that period, which started. I mean, there was a sort of first sort of uprising for independence in 45, and then it was quiet till 54. It started in 54. It got pretty ugly in 56, 57. The Battle of Algiers is 57, I think. Nobody from my family was living there at that point.
I was thinking of Frantz Fanon's writings.
Yes, absolutely. No, there's actually it is a fictional moment, but there's a moment in the novel where the character of my generation says to the grandfather, "Have you read Francois Fanon, and the grandfather says, "No, I have not," which seems to me actually, if I had asked him, that would have been the answer.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think there's someone coming up next.
Hello. I really loved your novel, The Emperor's Children, and in that book, the attacks of 9/11 were a real turning point for the characters. And I wondered, I assume that is sort of touched on in this book because it has a much broader sweep. I wondered what it was like to sort of revisit that from a different perspective and different context for this novel.
Thank you. So, in fact, there isn't a sort of 2001 moment that, as it were, the needle doesn't go down on the record at that point. There's the late 90s and then 2010. Not because there wouldn't be interesting things to write about and explore, but because the arc of the novel is really the life of François, who's the as it were, the character based on my father. So it opens and closes with him, and that it's not. I mean, obviously he was interested in and very distressed by and so on, but by the events of 9/11. But he was also at that point retired and different.
Thank you so much. I actually have to quarrel with you a bit now because you just said the book opens and closes with your father, but actually it closes with Gaston and Lucienne.
That's right, and it technically opens with Chloe because
yes,
it has a prologue that is Chloe.
And the only reason I have to mention that is because what is so fascinating all the way through, and I won't take up too much more time, about Gaston and Lucienne is that their love, their married love, their marriage is so central to their lives that ending the book this way reminds you of what it means to have a family, what it means to be involved in that kind of love, because some might call their love almost all-encompassing, that it almost keeps other people out, but it didn't necessarily keep their children or their grandchildren out because you've been able to capture it on the page. So that's why I brought it up, not to correct you, really. Question.
Yeah, hi. I see you. I want to ask a question about the concept of geography as character. And in The Emperor's Children, it's based in New York City. I haven't read this book, obviously looking forward to it, but I did open it up and I saw all the different points all over the world. And I'm wondering, how many of these are you personally familiar with? Did you visit and know about to the extent that you were comfortable writing about? And for those points that you hadn't visited, how do you go about getting comfortable enough to create a fictional world in a real place?
Such a great question.
Such a great question. And some of the places I knew well. Toronto, though I was just in Toronto and I don't know it well now. I don't know. They built a whole mess of buildings in the last 5 years. I don't know it now, but I knew it well. And France I knew well. I traveled to Thessaloniki because it opens in what was then Salonika in 1940, and I traveled there to sort of I didn't spend a long time, but to walk around and understand. I've been to Beirut. I have not been to Algiers. I have most of the places I had been, but not all. Not Buenos Aires either. When I wanted to, I would love to go to Buenos Aires. When I wanted to go, it was COVID. So, but how do you get? I think the ones that I don't know. Part of it, that thing I was just saying about Toronto. Part of it, what made it seem possible to me was the idea that I was writing about. Peter Carey describes historical fiction as a science fiction of the past, that you're actually always making up a world because the world isn't there. And certainly Algeria it's quite interesting. Sort of French colonial Algeria, the internet came into existence at a moment 20 some odd years ago, when enough people were still enough former colonials were still alive, that they made almost online archives of neighborhoods, and all the restaurants in the neighborhood, and photographs and the school pictures, and the class photos. Like, put up your class photo of the kindergarten from 1953. Like, there'll be the missing years because they didn't have but so there's this strange virtual archive that you can access and have a look. But it is, and then there are the description. I mean, my grandfather in the memoir describes the Algiers of his younger years, and so yeah. Who knows though? Who knows?
I love that Peter Carey observation. That's wonderful. Thank you so much, sir. Other questions? I don't know if this woman is getting up to ask a question or not. Hello.
So I've only had a chance to look at the prologue as I was sitting here, and in the prologue, it talks about how you wrote this book in a way to help heal, with an aspiration to heal. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how writing in this way about your family, even if it's underneath the papier-mâché, did that process feel healing to you? And how do you see memoir as, or fictionalized memoir as a way to help heal? Thanks.
Thank you, Debbie. I mean, I think there are many things. How long you got? I think I do believe in stories, and I believe in I know how much fiction has meant to me. My fantasy, my fantasy is to write fiction that is sufficiently vivid to live in a reader's memory as if it were a lived experience. I asked a neuroscientist, "Is this a possibility?" And they said, "I do not know." But that would be the. But that would be the. That would be the dream. And so part of that. Part of what healing, it seems to me, might be is having grown up with a lot of secrets and a lot of things that people don't talk about, to just in some way say, it's all okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's all okay. It's
it exists in complexity.
Yes,
it's not a simple
there's
black
no
and white.
There's no, and that's true for all of us, right? And I think of Chekhov as the writer who most supremely conveys the world that way. That we are all flawed mortals, and we are all struggling, and we all have failings, and we are unheroic, we are selfish, we are petty, but we're also loving and generous and resilient and kind. And when you mentioned earlier about the French sort of rejection of the pieds-noirs when they came, it was also the terrible, more egregious treatment of the Harkis, who were the Algerian colonials who sided with the French and then had to leave Algeria and come to France, and the French treated them abysmally. But I think it is that thing of, and I worry about it in this moment in our history, in this country and in the wider world, that we want to say, you are other and you do terrible things. I can look and point and judge you for your terrible things. And I suppose I wanted to write this book to say, officially in my worldview, even, I would look at my grandparents and say, oh, those aren't lives to emulate. What a terrible thing to be a colonial person. But but they were decent, kind, hardworking, good people who were in a particular moment in a particular history. And like some ninny, I guess I'm believing that the truth will set us free.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we've got someone ready to come up to the mic.
Yes, thank you. I haven't read the book yet, but I have a question about your grandmother. We've heard about your grandfather and the influence that he had on your life, and he was wise enough to leave you his memories and his thoughts. I don't know if your grandmother did the same thing or anything similar, but I'd like to know a little bit about your grandmother and the effects she had on you and the effects she had on the family.
Thank you so much. So there are a bunch of reasons. My grandmother does not, or the character who based on my grandmother, because I'm very insistent on the papier-mâché aspect, right? It's not my grandma. But she doesn't have a voice there aren't sections from her point of view. And there are several reasons for that. One I think is that just personally, for me, she suffered from dementia from the time I was quite young. So I didn't actually know her in the way I knew my other relatives. But also the other reason for that, and why not make her up the way I make up, Algiers, is that in this very Catholic patriarchal construct, there was the myth of their marriage, which, there was the religious devotion, so that literally I have a telegram from my grandfather to my grandmother when he's been billeted to Casablanca in 41, and you have to keep in mind that a telegram, every letter is costing money, and he says, I am here, I am sad but safe, and then he says, we must put our faith in him and trust that. It's like a whole, it's all about God. It's just like 3 lines about God. Okay, and then part of that is also that whole Mary thing. She wasn't called Mary, but she was a saint. And when I was growing up, to my mother's grave irritation, my grandmother, while demented and living, and after her death, was referred to by her husband and children as a lay saint. She is a lay saint. She was a lay saint. A lay saint. My mother was like, So I wanted to try to capture that sort of cipher. Much was projected onto her. And what was really interesting in reading the archive, they always said, my grandfather would say, oh, he wanted to be a writer, but he said, she was a much better writer. She is a much better writer than I am. This was at a time when my grandmother, who was always super sweet, but not, you couldn't really talk to her. Although there is at the table, she would say always, qu'est-ce qui manque à ton bonheur? What is missing from your happiness? Which is a lovely thing to say. But then I read her letters, and she was, a better writer than him.
Wow. And can I ask one more question? It sounds like you had to go through a period of really assessing your grandparents and that generation, and it took some time for you to get the distance, maybe to forgive. And I just wondered what that journey was like.
Well, it's interesting because I would say now, it's being young, right? You push against, I pushed against my parents as well. But I think also there was the additional layer of as I was saying earlier, my father having brought us, I was born here. He wanted us to be North American kids, and for any North American kid, the world that my grandparents lived in was literally like, what? I was mentioning the other day, this is just with my dad. I was in college in the late 80s, and 2 of my friends who were spending the summer in New York invited me to spend a few days with them, and they were 2 guys, and my father said, that's absolutely out of the question. And my mother said, oh, don't be ridiculous, Michelle, they're homosexuals. And it wasn't clear whether that was worse, right? Right? So that was the and he was way more way more in the modern world than they were, right? So,
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Because if not, then we can get a move on folding up chairs and forming a line, because I know many, many of you would like to have your book signed by Claire Messud. Thank you, Claire, so much.
Thank you, Bethanne, and thank you everyone for coming. Thank you so much.